This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hello everyone, I'm Nita Hone, and it is Wednesday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. In the last Top 10, I looked at lands that can produce mana of any color, and in this one, we're kind of looking at the opposite. Lands that don't produce any mana at all. We don't see these at all these days, but they used to be pretty common in the early days of Magic. These lands all come with activated abilities, and some of these lands had good enough abilities to overcome the fact that they don't produce mana, something that is obviously a huge downside. You don't want to be using an early land drop on something that doesn't actually produce mana most of the time. In all, there are 24 lands that do not produce mana, and in this video, we'll be looking at the 10 that have made the biggest impact on Magic's competitive scene. There are some lands that technically don't produce mana that I excluded. This includes all fetch lands and Vesuva. Vesuva is generally used to make a copy of a land that produces mana. Meanwhile, fetch lands are entirely focused on mana because they fetch you lands and they don't serve any other purpose. So while they don't produce mana for you, they are completely focused on getting you mana anyway. This includes more famous fetch lands that can find lands of two different colors, but also Terramorphic Expanse and Evolving Wilds. So with those caveats out of the way, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. Pro Tour and Mythic Championship top 8s, as well as Legacy and Vintage Championship top 8s are worth 2 points, and a Grand Prix top 8 is worth 1 point. Now, let's look at number 10. At number 10, we have Arena. Arena may not produce mana, but it can have your creatures fight your opponents, and that means it can frequently function as a repeatable removal spell. Granted, the creature that your creature fights is chosen by your opponent, so obviously it's not quite as good as some fight effects. Arena has an interesting history, as it was originally a promo card that could only be obtained through a promotion in a Magic the Gathering novel, but because it was time-shifted in Time Spiral, it's legal in Modern, where it managed a single Grand Prix top 8 in a Rug Aggro deck back in 2012. Without a standard legal reprint in the future, it is unlikely to ever get any more points, but it's also highly unlikely we see any lands in the future that don't produce mana, so Arena is probably going to hold on to its spot here. At number 9, I have Diamond Valley, a land that lets you sacrifice creatures and gain life equal to their toughness. It was featured in the sideboard of Zach Dolan's deck, which won the very first World Championship for Magic back in 1994. It was at its most useful against decks that were interested in using cards like Black Vice and Fireball to quickly damage opponents, as it provided a way to gain enough life to survive those cards. These days, we get lands with similar abilities that also produce mana, so Diamond Valley is unlikely to ever put up any more points, but back in 1994 it helped win a World Championship. And number 8 is Safe Haven, which allows you to tuck away your creatures for as long as you want to, and then allows you to bring them back on an upkeep if you sacrifice Safe Haven. An effect like this has a couple of uses. One of these is to hide your creatures so that you can cast a board sweeper, and then on the following turn, you can get back anything you exiled with it after the board has been cleared. On the flip side, it can also be used by aggro decks as a way of making sure a board sweeper won't be the end of them. It's even pretty useful just against spot removal because if you have mana up, you can save your creature. You can also use it to make use of cards that have Enter the Battlefield abilities, as it lets you trigger them again. Safe Haven's 1 Pro Tour top 8 came in Standard in 1996, where it was a sideboard card in a mono-black aggro deck that could bring it in against opponents who were playing board sweepers. At number 7, we have Glacial Chasm, a land that not only doesn't produce mana, but also has the dreaded cumulative upkeep mechanic. You have to pay 2 life, then 4 life, then 6 life, and so on every upkeep to keep it in play, and it has the additional downside of also making it so your creatures can't attack. It is actually pretty impressive that a card with so much downside has actually gotten 9 points, and it has seen play because the effect it brings, you can't be damaged at all, is actually quite powerful for 0 mana. Obviously, you don't want to be using this in your aggro deck, but there is a place for it. It saw a tiny bit of play back when it was printed in 1995, but it didn't really take off until 2010, when it burst onto the scene as part of a new deck in the Legacy metagame called Lands, a deck that runs somewhere around 35 lands, and can tutor up whichever ones it needs at will, and eventually wins the game by comboing Dark Depths and Thespian Stage. More on that later. The deck runs a singleton Chasm to be tutored up in situations where it's at its best. The Lands deck has gone on to be highly successful in Legacy, and Glacial Chasm is still actively putting up points, so it may move up this list in the coming years. At number 6, I have Thawing Glaciers. You may be thinking that this isn't that much different from a fetch land, but the fact that it bounces itself while fetching a land and requires mana to do it keeps it from being what I would consider a traditional fetch land, since it doesn't simply tap and search up a land right away. This, combined with the fact that it lets you grab lands over and over again, means that it had much different uses than traditional fetch lands do. In fact, Thawing Glaciers actually had to be banned from Ice Age block constructed. I don't think a regular old fetch land would ever be banned. So Thawing Glaciers made control decks way too good in Ice Age block constructed when combined with Zurin Orb. While these two cards may seem relatively harmless to us today, in that format, searching up a land and gaining 2 life every turn was a great mana sink that basically made aggro decks entirely irrelevant in the entire format, and it did this while also fixing your mana and thinning out your deck. So, it not only fixed mana, it powered up control decks considerably. It would go on to see play primarily in control decks in both standard and extended. At number 5 we have Dark Depths, which is the last land that doesn't produce mana that Wizards ever printed. Even when they did it here, they were doing it in Cold Snap, a set that made lots of references to much older Magic design since it was sort of the lost third set for Ice Age block. Dark Depths was a card that was pretty terrible when it first debuted. It was too slow to ever really be a threat. But, eventually, cards were printed that allowed you to rapidly remove all the counters from it at once. Combo decks emerged in Extended that used Vampire Hexmage to get the 2020 token as early as turn 2. This deck showed up in Extended's waning years, and when Modern was created to replace it in 2011, Dark Depths was on the preliminary ban list for the format and remains there until this day because the combo is that powerful. In Legacy, Dark Depths helped spawn the Lands deck, a deck loaded up with a bunch of easily tutorable utility lands, and the main win condition for the deck is the Dark Depths combo. The Legacy version of the combo uses Thespian Stage to get the giant Avatar token. Lands, as we've said, is still a relevant deck in Legacy, and Dark Depths is going to continue to accumulate points in the coming years. At number 4 we have Tabernacle of Pendrell Vale. The Tabernacle may not produce mana, but it very harshly punishes players who are playing a bunch of creatures, so that's probably okay. The Tabernacle has only seen play in the Eternal formats, and of course, solely in decks that run no creatures or very few of them, so they don't get punished by the effect of their own card. Like Dark Depths, it has seen the most play in Lands decks, as it is something you can tutor up against opponents when it is particularly devastating against them. It also sees play in the sideboard of Vintage Mud decks, an artifact-centric deck that plays several prison effects that make it hard for the opponent to have the mana to pay for their creatures every turn. Like Dark Depths, Tabernacle is likely to continue to add to its score, thanks to always appearing in Lands decks and Legacy. And number 3 is Bazaar of Baghdad, which was originally printed in Magic's very first expansion, Arabian Nights, which was released in 1993. It took forever to actually see play at the highest level, something I go into a bit more depth about in my MTG Top 10 from a few weeks ago on the cards that took the longest to finally get some points. Anyway, the Bazaar got to emerge from obscurity as a result of the emergence of the Dredge mechanic in 2005. It enabled Dredge decks to rapidly fill their graveyard and get huge value from the graveyard in a variety of ways. Dredge decks also don't care very much that this land doesn't produce mana because a lot of their stuff just comes into play from the graveyard for free. Dredge, specifically, is pretty much the only deck that makes sense for this card because between not producing mana and actually giving you card disadvantage, for most decks it wouldn't be a very good card. But the fact that it only sees play in Dredge decks is okay, because Dredge is one of the most powerful decks in Vintage. At number 2 we have Maze of Ith, a land that doesn't produce mana, but does provide you with a very useful activated ability. It has been used most frequently to essentially blank one of your opponent's attackers every turn, something that can really derail your opponent's plans. But it can also be used to bail your attacker out of a situation, and it really allows you to be aggressive with your attacks, because if anything doesn't go your way with how your opponent blocks, you can get your creature out of there. Maze of Ith was a powerful card in the early years of the game, and even got restricted in 1994, meaning you could only play a singleton copy of the card in your deck. It would also later be banned and extended. The Maze frequently made games long and uninteresting, and it was restricted just as much for that as it was because of how good it was. Like other cards on this list, the Maze has found the most success in Legacy lands, since it's a great land to be able to search up whenever you need it, as it shuts down some decks in the format. Especially reanimation decks really focused on trying to win the game with one huge creature. Maze of Ith is going to continue to put up points going forward, but it seems unlikely it ever catches the number 1 card on this list, which has a lot more points and is extremely active right now, and that's Eye of Ugin. Eye of Ugin reduces the cost of Eldrazi, and it can also tutor them up, and actually it can tutor up any colorless creature, but generally if a deck's running Eye of Ugin, that colorless creature will be an Eldrazi. Like a lot of cards on this list, Eye of Ugin did not have much success right after it was printed. Sure, it made Eldrazi cheaper, but all the good ones were insanely expensive in original Zendikar block. It managed a single top 8 at Worlds in 2010, which accounted for all of its points in the standard format. When we returned to Zendikar several years later, Wizards printed lots of lower mana cost Eldrazi who were already very efficient and powerful, and now Eye of Ugin would cut their mana costs in half or better at times. Decks running these new Eldrazi and Eye of Ugin, as well as Eldrazi Temple, utterly broke Modern in 2016, resulting in the so-called Eldrazi Winter. Eye of Ugin had to be banned to fix the format. The deck turned out to be so good that it was largely just ported to Legacy and Vintage, where the Eye is still legal, and it is one of the most important cards in the blisteringly fast Eldrazi aggro decks in both formats today. Well, that does it for this MTG Top 10. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to see the almost 200 other MTG Top 10s I've already made, you should see the playlist on your screen now. Thanks for watching.